This video is a code review of the Polaris Trade Management System, TMS, spreadsheet. It does not exactly represent the latest version of the code. This video plus the code comments are aids to better understand the code. Okay, first thing here, I'm going to remove worksheets that don't have any VBA code associated with them, namely Dropbox, TrustIt, and About. Next, going to take a quick look at the VBA code associated with what is called ticker worksheets, namely the one we're on here, this one. And you see that all these ticker worksheets use the same VBA code that we'll be going over later. So instead of showing all of them, I'm only going to show a few that have unique situations handled by the code that they all use in common. Okay, let's hit off those other worksheets. Leaves us with these worksheets that are currently being shown. First one I've got highlighted, the stock screen worksheet. It's got ancillary to the main purpose of the spreadsheet, so I'll quickly go over the VBA code behind it, and it's shown here. And it simply waits for the user to select A2 after entering in a query in cell A3, and then calls a subroutine to carry out this query. Now, what this worksheet is primarily for is to identify tickers that want to be looked at in more detail on the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this subroutine to query stock data. And all the queries, which there's 3, are located down here in Module 6. And this specific subroutine called Query Stock Screen is similar to the other 2 queries. So we're going to go through all 3 of these subroutines that carry out queries to the back-end database. You can see here they start off by clearing the area where the results set's going to go. Next, it sets up the connection string to the back-end database and then runs the query that was passed to it as a parameter to the subroutine. It gets the results back. It transposes rows and columns to align them with the way Excel looks at things. It then displays the field names at a specific location and then displays the results set. Does an auto fit of the cells that make up the results set, and then if there is an error, it will show the error number and an error description. Well, in this module, let's go ahead and scroll up here and look at the other 2 queries contained in this same module. One here is called Query TickerData. Goes out and grabs information around a list of tickers that have been provided as an input parameter. Unlike the other query that we look at, there is a check here to see if a troubleshooting flag is on, and if so, display a message indicating the subroutine has been called. But beyond that, it does pretty much the same thing. It clears out the landing area, sets up the connection string, runs the query, but instead of there being a query passed in, it's just the same query every time, which calls this stored procedure, and then transposes the array that's received back, displays the field names, the results set, and then finishes up. This other remaining query in this module is called the query prices subroutine, and it does something similar. If there's a troubleshooting flag set, it will display that this subroutine has been called. It'll then clear out the landing area on a specific worksheet. So unlike the other 2 queries where the results that go in specific worksheets, this query can have its results that go in one of many ticker worksheets. So it activates the ticker worksheet that was passed in, and then it clears out the landing area in that worksheet. Here's the connection string. And then a little bit of logic here as to which query should be run depending on which worksheet is being indicated. Now go ahead and set the worksheet equal to ticker, so it's clear that we're dealing with it at ticker. But if the ticker is S&P 500 down here versus some other worksheet, then we'll run 2 different queries. The S&P 500 worksheet gets its pricing information from a table called the S&P 500 Daily, whereas the ticker worksheets get their price data from a table called PriceHistory. Okay, having follow the execution of this stock screen VBA code all the way through this query subroutine, I'm going to go ahead and hide the stock screen worksheet. All right, next I want to talk about the manage worksheets. Manage worksheet is just to contain configuration information, any kind of status information about what's going on in the spreadsheet at a given time. But there is a little bit of VBA code behind this, and it's primarily just dealing with if the user were to select C16 or C17, and it's just some function I will see later on, but at the time the user sets these values on the manage worksheet, a message is displayed to make sure that that's what the user intended. Now, what they select C16 and C17 to is checked by calling this routine called max return parameter adjustments, and we'll talk about it more later. The other functionality here is just purely troubleshooting to hide and unhide specific columns in the ticker worksheets. And even though I'm done talking about the manage VBA code, I'm not going to hide the manage worksheet, because as we talk about some other VBA code, we'll occasionally need to come back to this worksheet and look at some values that are on it. Next, going to talk about the TickerData VBA code. Before we talk about the code itself, let's look at this worksheet. And the worksheet is similar to the remaining worksheets that we'll go through, is that there's cell in gray here, and by the way, any cell that's in gray means that it's intended for entry or selected by the user. And in the TickerData worksheet, there's only one cell, A2, and that's intended to be selected, and then it'll run the query that we saw in module 6. Back to the VBA code. You see here that checks to see if A2 has been selected. If so, it turns off screen updating and turns off calculation temporarily, and then makes a call to that module 6 subroutine to retrieve TickerData. And you can see here it checks to see kind of what mode the spreadsheet is currently in. And if the user just came to this worksheet and selected A2, then this message will be displayed indicating that it was retrieved by the data. It was retrieved by the user. That's not the normal way that this worksheet is invoked. Normally, it's while running other VBA code that has to do with the portfolio analyzer worksheet that VBA code will select A2, and then the results for the TickerData will be retrieved. Once the query's been run, then calculation is put back on. A check is made to see if it's okay to turn on screen updating, and then some alignment is done in terms of scrolling. Well, now that we're done discussing the VBA code behind TickerData, I'm going to go ahead and hide that worksheet. Now going to discuss the VBA code behind the randomness worksheet. This worksheet was previously called the Volatility worksheet. And to understand what's going on with that VBA code, you need to take a quick look at the Volatility worksheet. It's an ancillary functionality. It primarily has three inputs. One user can select D1 or can select AB4 and then make modifications to this number of periods in AB3. So if we go back and look at the VBA code, you can see here it's checking for a selection change for AB4, and then if it sees it, it generates some random numbers and puts them in the column AB based on the number of periods the user is interested in generating random numbers for. The other thing it looks for is if the user selects O2 and generates a single random number in that case, and then displays a message. And there is also a user cell change event here that this simply sees that the user selected AB3, and if it does, it just immediately selects AB4. Now that we are done discussing the VBA code behind the randomness worksheet, I'm going to go ahead and hide the worksheet. All right, next I'm going to talk about VBA code that executes when the workbook is first opened, and then here right before it's closed. It's contained in this module called ThisWorkBook. When the spreadsheet is first opened, some state information is saved off, and then that same information is compared to what the current values are at the time the spreadsheet is closed. And if there's been a change made while the spreadsheet has been opened, then a pop-up message is displayed recommending that the user save the spreadsheet. Okay, returning back up here to what's done when the spreadsheet is first opened. After this state information is saved off, then screen updating set to true, calculation is set to on, and some state variables are set to on that we'll be discussing further. And then a call is made to SystemCheck, which we'll come back and talk about in a second. And then it checks to see if there's any state variables in an unexpected state, and this displays messages informing the user they may want to consider changing it back to more normal states. So let's go back up here and talk about this subroutine called SystemCheck. It's located down here in Module 5. Starts off by writing some information to the Manage worksheet, namely the date that the spreadsheet was opened, the time the spreadsheet was opened, the name of the spreadsheet, and then it grabs the spreadsheet's version out of this as a global constant area, and then writes it so the user can see it on the Manage worksheet. Next, it checks the Excel version and then displays a message if it's considered a little bit out of date. Then it checks the internet connection, and then it shows a display if it has trouble connecting to the internet. And then from there, it makes a call to see when the back-end database was, the pricing information for stocks was last refreshed, and then writes that date in the Manage worksheet. Makes calls to identify the computer name and the username, and then calls a subroutine called spreadsheet open to log the use of the spreadsheet. Next, a check is made to see if the current spreadsheet is the current version. So a call is made to a subroutine called latest version. It pulls that from the back-end database. Pop-up message is displayed if the spreadsheet is considered out of date. Next, a check is made to see if there's a message that needs to be displayed. And then lastly, it will update what's called the Billboard, which is just an area on the Portfolio Analyzer screen that has a rotating message. Since this video was originally recorded, the PriceIntervals worksheet has been added to the spreadsheet. We are now going to discuss its VBA code. Here at the top is a comment about the different development rounds this worksheet VBA code has gone through. See the Graphing Price Intervals video on the Polaris Investing YouTube channel in the Polaris TMS app playlist for information on the navigation and use of this new worksheet. The video also includes a discussion on the development rounds of the worksheet. Okay, to start off, there is one major user change event dealing with any input in cells A1 through A4. When a user makes a change to one of those 4 cells, this code here is invoked and data is retrieved based on those user entry and then displayed in columns B through F. This other user change event deals with changing modes between using the Excel built-in stock history function or the Polaris direct data retrieval mode. Next, going to talk about the selection change event that occurs when the user selects cell A7 to graph the data that was just retrieved. As discussed in the Graphing Price Intervals video, graphing is separated from data retrieval. So by selecting A7, the user is indicating that they want to now graph the data that has been previously retrieved. This primarily involves copying the data from columns B and C, namely the date and closing price, over to these columns, AL and AM. Now notice the date in AL can be different than the date in column B, and that is discussed in the Graphing Price Intervals video. The copying of the data is done here in this loop, and in particular you see the date and the price being copied here. I'll return to what else is being done in this loop here in a bit. After the looping is done, a check is made to see if the user requested a price for the most recent day the market was open. If so, another check is made to see if the price was retrieved for that date. If not, the most recent date the market was open and the price on that date are appended to the data that was copied over. If so, the most recent price replaces the last price copied over. Next, information about what is being graphed is copied over from these cells here in column A. Finally, formulas are written to additional columns that deal with graphing, and that is done in this part of the code. The way that this code was originally designed to work was that once the data was retrieved, simply copy over the data in columns B and C over to columns AL and AM, and then use formulas for the other columns dealing with graphing. That works fine for most of the formulas, but when there's a large amount of data retrieved, these formulas here that include indirect functions result in performance problems. Recall, the indirect function is a volatile function. Volatile functions are recalculated on every calculation cycle. So if you have hundreds of prices retrieved, you can have thousands of indirect functions across these formulas. So instead of having the values in columns AO, AP, and AQ determined by formulas, now VBA code here determines those values. VBA has a worksheets function that can be called with either a worksheet number or a worksheet name, and then that's used to reference particular cells in that worksheet. That function is used many times in the VBA code that replaces the indirect formula. This is a huge advantage that VBA has over Excel functions because Excel functions have no comparable function. Okay, returning back to the original video. That leaves us just 6 worksheets, but really most of the VBA code we're going to talk about is here in the portfolio analyzer, and then we'll use this ticker ABV as representative of all tickers, and then talk about that common ticker code through discussion of this particular worksheet. Where we need to, we'll look at that common code where it pertains to just the portfolio worksheet, the S&P 500, or RandomWalk. All right, before diving into the portfolio analyzer VBA code, let's take a quick look at its worksheet. And you see here that there's 3 main cells that the user can select, namely here in A2, C17, and C22. And those cells have a slightly darker gray color to indicate that they are to be selected. The other gray cells are places where the user can make entries. A typical use case is the user makes entries into these gray cells. Then once it has everything set the way they want them, they then hit the execute. And then what the execute does is it goes off to the VBA code, activates the ticker worksheets one at a time, selecting those worksheets execution cell. So the VBA code that's in that common subroutine for all the worksheets gets executed once for each ticker worksheet. The other main use case is the user selects maximum return. And then what happens there is that a subroutine called max return is called, and some checks are made, and then it throws up this display to see if the user wants to proceed. One thing I mentioned down here, anything below this line here is kind of a staging area where your user can come here to this cell A22 and select a column F through, in this case, N. They could put in even more lists of tickers, and then by selecting that column, they let's say select column H, you'll see that the tickers are brought over into this area here, and then even a total investment across those tickers, and then what percentage per ticker can be decided on, and then execute is selected. Those tickers are now copied into this area up here, and then the VBA code behind that execute selection is run. Okay, let's dive into this Portfolio Analyzer VBA code. You see here that there's two main types of events. One is a user change event, and the other is a selection change event. Up here in the user change event, if the user were to make a change to cell A22, and on the Manage tab this feature is on, it'll display a message that says to be patient. The other user change event is if the user were to change cell R1, message is displayed indicating some typical values that the user would want to consider. Back down here to the select change event, there's 6 events that are looked for. The main one being if the user selects A2, this execute up here, and then the other one is if they select maximize return. You can see that down here. The 4 others are not that significant, but we'll really go through them. Is if the user were to select C22, it would automatically calculate these investment percentages. If the user were to select E1, it would return some of the values that the user can enter into back to default values. If the user were to select anything in this range here, it would highlight that row and make this hyperlink here in this cell active for this particular ticker. The VBA code it writes the cell that was selected by the user to a particular cell, and then conditional formatting in Excel takes care of highlighting the row. This last event that's handled has to do with auto completing, and when the user is typing in cell A22, turned off autofill. Alright, so that leaves the 2 main events that are handled by this VBA code, namely the user selects maximum return, and higher up is the when the user selects cell A2. First, I'm going to talk about what happens when the maximize return cell C17 is selected. Most of the code that gets executed is contained in this subroutine called max return, and that's because the main functionality is when the user hits A2, and that code is in line here. Next, going to go over what happens when the user selects cell C17, which corresponds to this VBA code for the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet. After turning off screen updating and going into manual calculation mode, a check is made to see if any user changes have been made across all the ticker worksheets. Exactly how this is done will be talked about now. If no user changes have been made, then we just drop down here and proceed. If there has been user changes, then a pop-up box is displayed asking if the user wants to proceed. If they say yes, then this subroutine called Ticker Worksheets Reset is called with the user's response. The Ticker Worksheets Reset subroutine is located in Module 5. You can see here it starts off by seeing if the user responded yes. If the user did, then it walks through each one of the ticker worksheets, restoring those worksheets. If the user chose not to continue, then the previous known state is restored and then returned from the subroutine. Now let's back up here and talk about what goes on with each one of these calls to restore a worksheet. That functions down here, and what it does for column P, column X, column AO, it restores formulas. So for column S, AG, and column AP, any user inputs are cleared out. Alright, returning back from the ticker worksheet reset subroutine call, if the user did decide to proceed, then the max return subroutine is called, and it's located also in Module 5. It starts off by indicating that it's running by just indicating that in the cell A19 on the Manage worksheet that all screen updating should be turned off. It updates the status bar. It then selects cell A2 on the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet. This updates the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet with whatever changes the user made before selecting Maximize Return. Then a subroutine is called to align the values entered in D17 and D18 with the minimum and step values that are in cells B16 and B17 on the Manage Worksheet. Adjustments to these values are needed to be made in order to ensure there is an integer number of iterations done here in the max return subroutine. And this adjustment is shown here, and I'll go through all the details, but essentially it ensures that it's within a certain range and that it will end up on the minimum value as it does its looping. All right, back to the max return subroutine. Next, it does an estimation of the number of loops going to be required to carry out what the user has requested. And then from there, it estimates the number of minutes, seconds, and then even the wall clock time that this max routine subroutine is expected to finish. Also, a check is made to see which cell here in column B on the Max Portfolio Analyzer worksheet the user wants to maximize. And then pop-up message is displayed with details about what the max routine is about ready to go to, and then asks the user if they want to proceed. If they do want to proceed, then pick up down here. The initial price decrease and increase are saved off in case they need to be restored later on. And then the values in cells D17 and D18 are updated with potentially adjusted values and then set up for looping. Now, the actual looping itself is done based on integer values to guarantee no issues. And so this code up here converts the fractional numbers into integer numbers that will be used in the actual looping. Inside the loop, first thing it does is a value to try for the decrease percent and a value to try for the increase percent is calculated, and those values are written to cells D1 and D2, and then cell A2 is selected. Next, a check is made to see if this is the first iteration through the looping, and if it is, it records the time, and since the time is recorded going into the looping, this results in the time it took to execute the first loop. This is used as an estimate for future looping. It'll then determine whether the value that was just calculated by selecting cell A2 is the best return so far. So it checks this cell, essentially in B1, if a better return has been calculated than up till now. And if so, it records it as the maximum return. And then also records what the values for decrease and increase were when this maximum value was calculated. Updates the loop count, then updates the status bar, and then continues looping. Alright, so when finished looping, calculates the total time it took during the loop, turns on screen updating so the user can see the best return and the values that resulted in that best return. Pop-up message is displayed with the results, and then the user is asked if they want to use the results or return back to what was used before the max return subroutine was executed. When the max return subroutine finishes, it comes back to where it was called, and that event here in the Portfolio Analyzer is now complete. So next we're going to talk about the remaining event and the most significant event that's handled here in the Portfolio Analyzer VBA code, and that's the event dealing with the selection of cell A2. When it gets selected, this code here gets executed. First part of the code is a troubleshooting code that for potential timing, and here at the bottom of the subroutine is the optional displaying of how long it took to run this particular subroutine. All right, let's go back to the start of this subroutine. It first checks to see if it's being called from the max return subroutine. And if it is, this flag will be off, meaning that when max return is running, it turns what's called the blackout fuse off, so the rest of the code knows that during this time should not be displaying anything to the screen. So this section of code is executed if not currently in the max routine subroutine. Means that users is simply on the portfolio analyzer worksheet and has selected cell A2. First thing it's done here is it saves off the current message onto the manage worksheet, and then it puts the new Billboard message into that cell on portfolio analyzer worksheet. It does that by calling it a subroutine that communicates with the backend SQL Server database and pulls the most recent Billboard message to be displayed. The font that's used in this cell M1 is determined by conditional formatting, where it looks at what the message used to be, which is now stored on the manage worksheet, compared to what the new message is. And if it happens to be the same message, then the font through conditional formatting is grayed out. But if it's a new message the user hasn't seen recently, it'll be in bold font. All right, with the handling of the Billboard out of the way, the focus of this subroutine is now started. And first thing is the start time is recorded, and then all screen updating is turned off and calculation is turned off, and this master fuse manage worksheet cell 818 is set to off to indicate that inside the portfolio analyzer execute code, and it's not wanting any screen updating to be done during this time. Next, a check is made to see if the user's made any changes between the last time they selected execute and this time. Changes meaning any of the gray cells on the portfolio analyzer worksheet. Collectively, all the gray cells are referred to as the portfolio state. Things like these cells here, investment percentages, tickers, really anything in gray. If it's changed, then this code is executed. Cell B23 on the manage worksheet is set to either different or same by comparing the last portfolio state information with the current values, and if they're different, that value on the manage worksheet will be different, otherwise it'll be same. Alright, so assuming that portfolio states are different, next thing is done is to check to see if there's been any user entries associated with the previous portfolio, and that's done by looking at specific cells to see if there's zero. Well, these cells are all on the portfolio worksheet, and each one of these cells sums up a particular cell on each one of the ticker worksheets, and those cells on those ticker worksheets sum up user changes in specific columns. So if all the totals are zero, then that means there's no user changes. In addition, a check is made to see if the only difference from the previous portfolio state is the ending date. If this is true, then the user changes on the ticker worksheets will still be valid even after additional prices are retrieved. So either there are no user changes on the ticker worksheet, or regardless if there are user changes or not, they're not impacted. Either one of those conditions is true, then a pop-up message is going to come up asking the user if they want to proceed, and then showing them what it is that's changed. If there hasn't been any significant changes that would impact the ticker worksheet values, then we just immediately jump down here to the proceed section. Now, after the user has indicated whether they want to proceed or not, then this routine called ticker worksheets reset is called with the user's response, and we've already talked about that subroutine. So next we pick up down here where assume that the user wants to proceed. Now here in the proceed section, the first thing is done is a check is made to see if this code was initiated by the user just by clicking cell A2, or if it was initiated through the max return subroutine. If it was initiated by the user, then this blackout fuse will be on, and so a status will be displayed in the status bar, indicating how long it's likely going to take to run through the remaining part of this subroutine. Next, a little housekeeping is done here, where cells that users have a tendency to accidentally overwrite are restored. Next, check is made to see if there's been any changes to the tickers, or if the ending date of the portfolio has changed. If either one of those conditions is true, then I'm going to go out and pull from the backend database updated data about the tickers. Now, tickers themselves may not have changed, but data about them may have changed over time. So by checking, in addition, the ending date of the portfolio, which will change if price data is updated on the back-end database, then we'll pull updated ticker information. Next, the tickers to be requested are determined by walking through the requested list on the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet, and then constructing a string consisting of those tickers. Then the ticker data worksheet is activated by selecting cell A2 on that worksheet. We've already been through that code. And then what comes back from that will be the tickers that are actually found. So then those tickers that are found are placed up here in this part of the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet. So the tickers that are listed in cells A4 through A14 can be different than what was requested down in cells A23 through A32 based on which tickers were found in the back-end database. All right, next, cell A3 on the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet is updated to reflect the number of tickers that were found. And just so you know, down here in cell B21 is the number of tickers that were requested, and if those numbers are different, both these cells would turn red. Cell A2 also is a hyperlink that will take you to the Manage worksheet and let you look quickly at what the most recent portfolio state that's been saved. Next, a check is made to see if we're in this section of code, because ticker list has changed and not just the ending date would require a new updated information about pre-existing tickers. But we have new tickers. Then some house cleaning is done here to set up for the new ticker list. All right, next part of the code does some fairly expensive or time-consuming operations that involve changing the worksheet names. If you just think about when you change a worksheet name, all the formulas on that worksheet and all references to cells on that worksheet have to change. So it's quite a bit of work that Excel has to do each time a name of a worksheet changes. But if tickers have been updated, we aren't sure whether the tickers overlap with previous tickers or really what the new tickers are. So all the worksheets are initially renamed. Then once all those neutral names have been set for the worksheets, then each ticker that was retrieved from the backend database, the name is used to set the name of the worksheet. Next, a pop-up message is displayed if the number of tickers requested is different than the number of tickers that were retrieved. And then from there, because the list of tickers requested could be different than the list of tickers actually retrieved, has to walk through all the different tickers and compare them to the tickers that were retrieved, and then figures out what the investment was for each one of those tickers, and then moves the investment up into this area up here, named in column R. All right, next, the portfolio state on the Manage worksheet is updated. All right, so next, the individual ticker worksheets, including the S&P 500, RandomWalk, and portfolio, are invoked, or they're hidden, because if the user had selected a ticker list that was less than 10 tickers, some of these worksheets are not occupied and therefore hidden. The invoke or hide ticker worksheet subroutine is called 13 times for the 10 tickers and then for these 3. Number subroutine is located here in module 5. See here that it activates the worksheet that was passed to it. Looks to see if the worksheet is one of those neutral name worksheets. If so, it just hides the worksheet. Else, it invokes the execution of the worksheet by selecting cell D2 on the worksheet. So for instance, this AB worksheet, that's the selection that's made, and then we'll be going through the VBA code that's executed in response to that selection being made. And then it checks to see if this worksheet should be hidden or not, and it does that by looking at a previously saved value. If the ticker list is changed, then the new worksheet will be visible. After calling the invoke or hide ticker worksheet, since that subroutine does activate the individual ticker worksheets, let's reactivate here the portfolio analyzer worksheet. Then the most critical step is performed, and that is calculations turned back on. So through all this processing that we've been talking about, calculation has been turned off even as these individual ticker worksheets are invoked. Since calculation was turned off when VBA invoked all the ticker worksheets, some of the calculation that would normally be done in those ticker worksheets were not done. So now that calculation is on, calls are made to this subroutine called auto override to execute code that would have otherwise been executed up here. Okay, as this subroutine finishes up, it calculates the total amount of time it took to run through the VBA code. And then it clears the status bar if not being run through the max return subroutine. Then positions the cursor back to A1 on the portfolio analyzer worksheet, indicates that the master fuse is back on, so there's no restrictions in terms of displaying, at least from the portfolio analyzer VBA code. If this wasn't invoked through the max return subroutine, then screen updating is turned back on, calculation is re-enabled, and as we already discussed, if the user chose to see how long this subroutine took to execute, a pop-up box is displayed. The last major VBA code to discuss is the common code in all the ticker worksheets, consisting of subroutines to handle selection change and user change events. First, I'm going to mention briefly a little bit of unique code in the RandomWalk ticker worksheet. It calls the same subroutines that the other ticker worksheets call, but in addition to that, has a little bit of code here to handle the selection of AU2. If AU2 is selected on the RandomWalk worksheet, then D2 is selected. This simply saves the user from having to scroll far to the left to select D2. Alright, next going to review this ticker worksheet selection change subroutine that is common to all the ticker worksheets. It's located in module 5 towards the bottom. Now recall this common ticker worksheet selection change event handler is called by the different ticker worksheets VBA code that is in the process of handling a selection change event. What's passed to this routine is the target address. Just like we saw with the portfolio analyzer code here at the beginning, the start ticks is recorded, and then optionally at the end the user can select a value on the manage worksheet to display the number of ticks it took to execute this subroutine. Now recall a ticker worksheet can be invoked either from the VBA code behind this execution on the portfolio analyzer worksheet, or a user can come directly to the ticker worksheet and select. What we're seeing here in the VBA code is that regardless of which approach resulted in this VBA code being executed, the screen updating is turned off and calculation is turned off. Now, if it was invoked from the portfolio analyzer, calculation is already off. Right, the next thing is done is a check is made to see if the subroutine was called from the portfolio analyzer VBA code. If not, then assume the user selected cell D2 on the ticker worksheet. Now, regardless of how this code is invoked. What it basically does is the same thing. It updates the query prices, checks to see if it happens to be the RandomWalk ticker, and then calls a random number generator to generate the prices for that ticker worksheet. And you can see that same code down here. Now the difference is when it's invoked through the Portfolio Analyzer VBA code, a check is made to see if it did get invoked that way, and then a check is made to see if the ticker on this worksheet, or the start price, or the end price, so the ticker here, the start price, and then the end price is at the very end of the worksheet. If those are different than the current portfolio state, then a call is made to update the prices, and we've already been through that subroutine in Module 6. Now, if the user initiated this VBA code, then there is no further check made. It assumes that the user wanted the prices to be updated, so the call is made to the query prices subroutine. Happens to be the RandomWalk ticker. Then still make a call to the query prices subroutine to get the dates, and then for each date that's filled in with a random number. The check is made to see if in the RandomWalk worksheet, or if doing some troubleshooting you don't want this pop-up message to be displayed, but if it was a user-initiated invocation of the VBA code, this pop-up message is displayed. And one last thing, when the query prices subroutine is called, either through the portfolio analyzer or by the user, the result of that calling that subroutine is placed in the first 3 columns of a ticker worksheet. Okay, so after this section of code up here runs, which essentially just updates the query prices, then do a section here that has to do with committing the new portfolio state to each ticker worksheet. And that involves going out to the Manage worksheet where the current portfolio state is saved, and then copying specific values onto the ticker worksheet. And the 6 values that are copied are shown here. And then a 7th one is moved over, has to do with the initial investment, and then a little bit of housekeeping, particular values set to 3 so that no rows are highlighted. So if we go look at the example ticker worksheet, what we're talking about is these values are written, these values here, and this value here. Also the limit mode in cell W1 and the initial investment in M4. After all the portfolio state data is written over to the ticker worksheet, a check is made to see if the user initiated this VBA code or whether the portfolio analyzer did. And if the portfolio analyzer did, then this fuses off and we don't start up calculation or turn on screen updating or run this auto override subroutine. Now if the user just came to the ticker worksheet and selected execute, this calculation would be turned back on now, and screen updatings would be true, and overrides would be processed in this subroutine. So really what's happening here is that instead of having these values in these different cells just be formulas referencing cells on the portfolio analyzer worksheet, and then letting them recalculate whenever changes are made on the portfolio analyzer worksheet. The cells are not formulas on the ticker worksheets, and they're written to it at a very specific time, and then calculation is done either here or back in the portfolio analyzer into that one bulk calculation, which is executed once all the ticker worksheets have been updated with the current portfolio state. Alright, ticker worksheet VBA code then finishes up by scrolling down to the last row and over to the far left, and then places the cursor on cell D1. And as we discussed earlier, if the user chooses on the Manage Worksheet to display how long this routine took to run, this code would execute in here, but that's more of a troubleshooting step. And you notice here that if this VBA code here for the Ticker worksheet is invoked from the Portfolio Analyzer code, this section of code does not run. So if we go back to the Portfolio Analyzer, where all these different Ticker worksheets are invoked from, and then we do the bulk calculation here. Once the calculation has been turned on, then we come back and now process the auto overrides for each one of the Ticker worksheets, providing we're not in the max return subroutine. Next, I'm going to take a look at the auto override subroutine. For it to make a little more sense, let's go look at a typical Ticker worksheet. And up here in S1 is a value that's either obtained from the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet, or it can be overridden here, for instance, for one of these values. These values can range from auto defer sell, auto defer buy, auto defer all, which means sell and buy, auto cancel sell, auto cancel buy, or auto cancel all. Close means auto is not currently active. Override only pertains to the last row on a Ticker worksheet. So checks are made to ensure that the date associated with that last row is equal to the last day of the portfolio off the Portfolio Analyzer worksheet. That should always be true, but a check is made to make sure it's true. Also, a check is made to make sure that the auto override feature is activated on the Manage worksheet. And then the last check is to ensure that we're not in the Portfolio worksheet, because the auto override doesn't pertain to that worksheet. If those conditions are met, then that cell S1 we just went through, its value is checked. And if there's any reference to cancel out of any of the values that it could take on, then this code is executed. Otherwise, it checks to see if there's any reference to defer. Then this code is checked. So let's back up here. If there is a value in cell S1 that pertains to cancel, then it sets the override value in column S for that last row equal to a value based on whether the current override in S1 is a cancel buy or a cancel all. And if the value currently in the last row is a buy, then it'll automatically cancel that buy. Now, if it's or cancel sell or cancel all, and the last row contains a sell, then it'll be cancel sell. And then down here, if it was a defer, if it was a defer buy or a defer all, and the last row has a buy, it'll then auto defer the buy. And then same thing here for sell or all. If it was a defer and it is a sell, then it'll set the override to auto defer sell. Well, back to the Ticker worksheet selection change VBA code. What we've talked about up till now is what happens when the D2 or the execute is selected by the user or selected by other VBA code. But there's other events besides the selection of D2 that are handled in the VBA code, and those other events are shown down here. So next I'm going to talk about the VBA code for these events. Working from the bottom up, let's start off talking about this section of VBA code that has recently been added to support an alternate use of the Cumulative Shares column U. There is a specific video in the TMS playlist that discusses this feature, so I invite you to watch it to better understand what this VBA code is doing. This code here was recently added as well that displays a pop-up message reminding the user to now use columns BU and CB instead of column P to make changes to the cash percent to maintain when successfully buying and selling stock. This next section of code moves the cursor away from the selected cell. If the cell was selected in any one of these columns in the row that does not contain an order, then the cursor is moved away from that cell. For these columns, it's any row beyond row 4 does or does not contain an order, and we move the cursor away from the cell and place it there. Should note that if there is no code explicitly dealing with a column, namely columns D, E, G through L, A, G, A, P, the cursor is not returned back to any specific location. Therefore, the user could type something in, but it's being assumed that the user will not mistakenly overwrite cells in these columns. Okay, that leaves this code here that has to do with the rows that are currently occupied. This code here is used to record the row selected in column D. Conditional formatting is used to highlight the row based on the row recorded. Okay, this code remaining to be discussed handles the event when a user selects a cell in an occupied row containing an order and in one of the following columns where user input is expected: BU, CB, X, AO, or U. Or a user selects a cell in any occupied row and in one of the following columns where user input is expected: F, S, A, G, or W. Note, for column W, only rows up to 4 are included. If the above conditions are met, a check is made to see if there's any existing user input in rows beyond the current selected row. If so, next row is set to the first row that contains existing user input following the current selected row. And a pop-up box is displayed asking the user if they want to remove previous entries beyond the current row and then proceed with adding input in the currently selected row. Previous entries beyond the current row are removed because new entries in the current row will likely propagate the values in subsequent rows. If there is no existing user input in rows beyond the current selected row, next row is set to 301. 301 is used because the ticker worksheets do not have space for occupied rows beyond 300. You can see that here. If I scroll down to the bottom of a ticker worksheet, you can see here that the last available place to put content is here at row 300. Actually, since a maximum of 5 years of weekly price data can be used, there will never be an occupied row beyond row 263. Ticker worksheets have more space for occupied rows than needed, just as a precaution. Alright, now let's walk through how it's determined if there's any existing user input in rows beyond the current selected row. The very versatile Excel SumProduct function is used in the evaluate function to check multiple columns for existing user input. If there is existing user input, the value of 1 is multiplied by the row number, resulting in a number less than or equal to the last occupied row. If there is no existing user input, the value of 1,000 is multiplied by the row number, resulting in a number greater than 300. The minimum row number from checking the columns is recorded in next row. If there is no existing user input in any of the columns, next row is set to 301. Next, if it was detected that there is existing user input, a message box is displayed asking the user if they want to proceed. And if they do, then any of those existing user entries will be removed or returned back to their default So here the check is made to see if the user responded yes, and then it starts setting values back to their default values, particularly for the columns that were checked down here. Make note of the use of formulas in row 301 to restore formulas. If the user selected no, then the cursor is returned back to a particular location and the event handler is exited. Assuming the user chose to proceed, if the user selected a cell in columns BU, CB, X, U, F, or AG, the cursor's left in the cell selected for the user to type in an entry. If a cell in column AO is selected, each time the user selects the cell, different items in a menu are displayed. If a cell in column S is selected, each time a user selects the cell, different items in a menu are displayed. Next, we're going to go back up here to the ticker worksheet and recall that there's two subroutines. Recall one that we just went through for the selection change events, but there's another one here for user change event, and that subroutine is located here in module 5, just a little bit beyond the code we were just discussing. So I'm going to discuss what it does next. There are two user change events handled by the subroutine. One is if on any of the ticker worksheets, user changes cell G2 or changes cell AB2 or AC2, and those are the two events. So let's go look at the typical ticker worksheet, and so you can see firsthand what we're talking about here. So if user were to go up here to G2 and select another ticker, we'll see here that the orange lines over here will change. So that's called the comparative ticker. The blue line is the ticker that worksheet that you're on, and then the orange line is taken from one of the other ticker worksheets. And then for a quick visual comparison, user can select which of the other tickers they want to compare this ticker, in this case AB, to. So here I just switched it back to the S&P 500, which is the default. Now over here in AB2 and AC2, the user can choose to show the buy points. So like here we did a buy at a particular price point and then another buy here, and you can see here that on the lower graph only, it'll show you in red exactly the points that it made a buy. And in order to free up space so that can be seen more clearly, the comparative ticker is removed temporarily, and then as soon as the user comes over here and either selects a comparative ticker or comes up here and chooses to hide, then the comparative ticker is shown again. Same thing for selling. Whenever a sell is done, the user can choose to show the cell, and then we'll see the comparative ticker disappear, and then green dots will appear at the exact points that cells were occurred. Now the user could even decide to do both, then the graph gets kind of cluttered, but you see a combination of green and red. So let's go through the VBA user change event code. If the user is selecting cell G2, therefore changing the comparative ticker that's going to be used on the two graphs. The top graph on all the ticker worksheets is referred to as chart 2, and then the bottom is chart 3. On that top chart, chart 2, you simply take the change that the user made and then go out to that worksheet and grab the ticker's price data and bring it onto this chart 2. Now chart 3, do a little bit more. First of all, you set AB2 and AC2 to hide both buying and selling data points. And then depending on whether the user selected S&P 500 or some other ticker for the comparative ticker, will display either the S&P 500 stock return, or from that other ticker worksheet, the rebalance returns from those ticker worksheets. This other user change event has to do with the user deciding to display buy or sell data points, and therefore only impacts the chart 3 at the bottom of each ticker worksheet. So if the user does want to display either a buy or a sell data points, then the comparative ticker line is hidden, which is done by using the S&P 500 column that has all NAs in it. So that line is then hidden. Yeah, buy and sell data points are displayed by virtue of the columns A, S, and AT, and they contain formulas that include these values. So when the user wants to show them, they no longer are NA, but the values that. Now, if this event is triggered, but the user does not want to display buy or sell data points, then the comparative ticker line needs to be restored. And that is done like was shown earlier up here. Since this video was originally recorded, there's a couple of changes made relative to how graphing is done. One is, instead of having separate user change cells for buying and selling, now there's just a single cell, AC1. AC2 has been added to allow the choosing of either seeding the value of AC1 to the portfolio worksheet or having it selected right here in the ticker worksheet. So what I mean by seeding, if you come over here to the portfolio worksheet and, for instance, here select show by, then we go back and look at a ticker worksheet, you see that its value in AC1 has changed to a show by. The existing VBA code has changed little. Instead of looking for two different cells changing, one for buy and one for sell, now it's been consolidated into just one cell, AC1. And then a new user change event is now handled around AC2. You can see here that if we're in the portfolio worksheet when AC2 is selected, then AC1 is said to hide both because there are no buy-sell data points on the portfolio worksheet. But then it goes off and activates the other ticker worksheets, setting the value of AC1 on each one of those worksheets. If they've seeded that value to the portfolio worksheet, then it's set to what the portfolio worksheet is set to. Otherwise, it's set to the value that's there on the ticker worksheet. It does that for all the ticker worksheets, and then turns screen updating back on. And if not currently in the portfolio worksheet, then the same logic is run to set AC1 on that ticker worksheet. Next, going to switch to reviewing some of the back-end database objects that are used along with this spreadsheet. And you can see here that there's 4 different stored procedures that are used. So quickly to go through those. The message board is something that's displayed when the spreadsheet is first brought up, and you can see right now that there's no, the null message is displayed. So when the Excel spreadsheet sees that, it won't display anything. But if there was a message to be displayed, it would be created here. The open spreadsheet is called to record information about the use of the spreadsheet. The Billboard is similar to the message board, but this is what the different Billboard messages that get displayed where they originate from through this called stored procedure. And then the TickerData stored procedure is called to get what passed in is the tickers, and then specific fields related to the tickers are retrieved from the Reuters view. Additional objects include tables, primarily the spreadsheet open log table. It's just every time that store procedure is called, logged in this table. Version information is logged here. Price history table contains prices for tickers. This is weekly prices on a Friday of each week. The S&P 500 daily table contains daily prices for the S&P 500. And then in the stock screen worksheet, the price statistics is a table that can be used as well. Just one view, which is to go get the latest version number. That view is selected. And that's all the database objects used by this spreadsheet. Okay, that is it for the VBA code review of the Polaris Trade Management System spreadsheet. I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.